Joe Kidd is easily one of Clint Eastwood's most overlooked westerns, so let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 20 things you didn't know about Joe Kidd, including how the cast almost looked very different, the famous spaghetti western that inspired it, and how behind the scenes issues almost derailed the entire production. So Joe Kidd actually shares a lot of DNA with The Great Silence, a 1968 spaghetti western directed by Sergio Corbucci, who's best known for directing Django. But in many ways, The Great Silence was his more impressive film, following a mute gunslinger defending a group of outlaws against a vicious bounty hunter, exploring the thin line between right and wrong. So having essentially become the face of spaghetti westerns in the US, Clint Eastwood was reportedly interested in starring in an English-language remake of the movie, and rumour has it that 20th Century Fox bought the rights to The Great Silence with the hope of luring Eastwood away from Universal Studios, even going as far as to hold off on releasing the original Italian version in the States to make way for its impending remake. However, when the studio head actually sat down to watch the movie, he was apparently deeply unimpressed with the film, especially its infamously cynical ending. As a result, talks of any remake quickly dried up, but Clint Eastwood made a point of paying tribute to what could have been by including lots of references to The Great Silence in Joe Kidd, including its wintry setting, the hat that Eastwood wears, and the appearance of a Mauser C96 pistol. Now, the story for Joe Kidd originally started out as a screenplay called The Sonoma Courthouse Raid, written by Elmore Leonard, a veteran Western writer who previously penned the stories that inspired 3:10 to Yuma, The Tall T, Hombre, and even Justified. And Joe Kidd was actually one of the first times that Leonard wrote an original story specifically for the big screen, with the second coming 2 years later in Mr. Majestic, starring Charles Bronson, which was similar to Joe Kidd in that it also starred an iconic Western actor playing a no-nonsense tough guy who defends vulnerable Mexican characters. So Joe Kidd is actually partly based on real events, as Elmore Leonard was very much inspired by a famous activist who headed up a movement by Mexicans to reclaim their ancestral lands from Anglo ownership, which led to the storming of a New Mexico courthouse in 1967, which is somewhat reminiscent of the opening scene in Joe Kidd, where Louis Chalmer and his followers break into the Sonoma courthouse to protest their stolen land. So once the script was picked up, it was retitled Joe Kidd, and Universal decided to go with John Sturges as director, best known for westerns such as Bad Day at Black Rock, Gunfight at the OK Corral, and The Magnificent Seven. However, probably his most famous film was The Great Escape, which was widely considered a masterpiece, setting expectations sky high for Joe Kidd. So when it came to casting the main character of Joe Kidd, John Sturges clearly wanted to go for an actor that he'd worked with in the past, approaching Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen to star, but both of them turned him down. As a result, the part was offered to veteran actor Robert Mitchum, but he too said no. So following his failed attempt to remake The Great Silence, Clint Eastwood was approached by Universal about starring in Joe Kidd, which had a somewhat similar premise on paper. But the biggest draw for Eastwood was the fact that Elmore Leonard had written the script, considering how many of his stories had gone on to inspire classic Western movies. But with that being said, Eastwood still wasn't 100% sold on the project, mainly because the movie didn't yet have an ending. But director John Sturges proved to be a talented salesman, convincing Eastwood that it wasn't a problem, and that it would be figured out along the way. So eventually, Clint Eastwood accepted the role of Joe Kidd, and was believed to have been granted significant creative influence over the movie in return. Another issue that they had with casting was for the character of Frank Harlan, a wealthy landowner that acted as the central villain of the film, because initially they were dead set on Gene Hackman, but he had to turn the role down, as he was already busy shooting for the Poseidon adventure. This led to Robert Duvall being cast instead, who ultimately did a good job of elevating what could have been a fairly one-dimensional villain. So even though Clint Eastwood wasn't the first choice for Joe Kidd, upon joining the film he was reunited with more than a few familiar faces. For instance, actor Don Stroud had already shared the screen with Eastwood in Coogan's Bluff. Likewise, the film's composer Lalo Schifrin had already worked with Eastwood as a composer on Kelly's Heroes, The Beguiled, and Dirty Harry. Even the cinematographer Bruce Surtees was a frequent collaborator of Eastwood's, having previously shot The Beguiled, Play Misty for Me, and Dirty Harry. So with Clint Eastwood now in the starring role, it would make sense for those behind the movie to want to lean into his iconic turn as the man with no name, given how popular those movies proved to be. So much like A Fistful of Dollars, the movie positions Clint Eastwood as a no-nonsense gunslinging anti-hero caught between two warring factions, and even features a character called Ramon. Likewise, the film's score feels very much inspired by the work of Ennio Morricone, giving Joe Kidd a pseudo-spaghetti western flavor, despite being an American production. Joe Kidd also showcased a lot of unique firearms that didn't typically appear in all that many westerns at the time, with perhaps the most eye-catching being the C96 broom-handle Mauser, which later in the movie is fitted with a stock so that it can be shouldered like a rifle, much like its appearance in The Great Silence. The movie also features a notable amount of scoped rifles, including a Savage 99, a Remington Keen Frontier, and a Canadian Ross Model 1910, which for the most part were historically accurate. So when Joe Kidd finally started filming, it was mainly filmed in the Alabama hills at Lone Pine, California, but the fictional town of Sonora was actually shot in Arizona, on a western town set used for famous John Wayne movies such as Rio Bravo and El Dorado. So once production on the movie began, it quickly became clear that Clint Eastwood was not at all well, apparently showing symptoms of a bronchial infection. But it turned out that he was actually suffering from a debilitating allergic reaction, originally believed to be brought on by horses. However, it eventually became clear that it was in fact being caused by cats that were sneaking into the hotel that he was staying in while filming. Another thing that apparently caused tension behind the scenes was the lean, economical directing style of John Sturges, who was viewed by some as treating filmmaking as just a day job, especially towards the end of his career. In fact, in an interview, actor Don Stroud even went as far as to say that Sturges just wasn't there and wasn't in charge during the making of Joe Kidd. He also claimed that one day Clint Eastwood personally arranged for an ice cream truck to drive out to where they were shooting in the middle of nowhere, just to try and cheer everybody up. Even writer Elmore Leonard was disappointed with how the filming went, believing that the cast was so awestruck by Sturges and his reputation as a director that they simply surrendered authority to him. Now, one person on set who certainly wasn't hands-off was Clint Eastwood, who was believed to have had quite a lot of creative control over the movie, which ended up being noticeably different to the original script. For instance, the character of Louis Charmer was apparently far more layered and heroic in the script compared to how he appeared in the final film, and some believe that the reason for this was that Clint Eastwood wanted to make it more obvious to the audience that Joe Kidd was the main hero of the film, and therefore Charmer was ultimately made to look more opportunistic and less sympathetic as a result. Perhaps as a consequence of the changes to his character, actor John Saxon apparently later regretted playing Louis Charmer, especially as he wasn't actually of Mexican descent like his character. There are even rumors that he attended a meeting of a Latin American organization opposed to stereotypes to publicly apologize for playing such a dubious character. So even when Joe Kidd was filming, nobody working on the movie knew for sure how the film was actually going to end. But one day on set, John Sturges noticed a railway track that ran straight through town, which stopped yards away from a saloon. This apparently led him to half-jokingly suggest that the train should crash through the bar room in the climax of the movie, to which Eastwood responded, "Jesus, anything at this point, let's end it," capping off the movie with probably its most memorable moment. So considering all the reports of problems on set, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that Joe Kidd features quite a few mistakes. For instance, at the start of the film when Joe's lying on the cot in jail, his cellmate pours coffee into a mug on the corner of the table, but then proceeds to fill it again in the next shot. Also, during this shot of Joe, you can see a priest exit the church in the background. And in the very next scene, you can see the same priest coming out of the church again. Then later on in the film, during the shootout in the village, when one of the henchmen is shot in a doorway, you can actually see the brick wall he lands against shake like it's made of rubber. So when Joe Kidd finally premiered in 1972, the movie grossed $6.3 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing westerns of that year. So not only did John Sturges beat out the sequel to his most famous western, but Joe Kidd also became his second most successful film at the box office, just behind The Great Escape. So despite a strong box office showing, Joe Kidd received a very mixed reception from fans and critics alike. For instance, Roger Greenspun of the New York Times said, "For perhaps its first half hour, John Sturges' new western, Joe Kidd, looks surprisingly good. Nothing remarkable, but modestly decent. A feeling that persists with continuingly diminishing assurance, almost until the climax, when everything is thrown away in a flash of false theatrics, foolish symbolism, and what I suspect is sloppy editing." But nowadays, there's a general acceptance that although Joe Kidd is certainly one of Clint Eastwood's weakest Western outings, it still has a lot going for it, and plenty of potential, but for whatever reason clearly fell short of what it could have been. So following the release of Joe Kidd, Clint Eastwood rarely spoke about the movie, unlike his other westerns that he was clearly a lot more proud of. In fact, in his biography, Joe Kidd is described as a totally conventional western, utterly without distinguishable characteristics. And perhaps tellingly, Joe Kidd was the last western that Clint Eastwood ever starred in that he didn't direct himself, with his next movie being High Plains Drifter, which proved to be a huge critical and commercial success. So let me know below, how do you feel about Joe Kidd? Do you think it's a disappointment or more of a hidden gem? Also, if you liked this video, it would massively help me out if you could leave it a like, and you might also want to check out this video right here.